Welcome to Truth Watchers. I am Heath Henning. Back in May this year, I had interviewed Brother Steve Montgomery about the Gnostic influence in the New Apostolic Reformation, or the NAR. He discussed how doctrinal elements of the NAR can be traced directly back through history with the Later Rain movement, 17th century mystic Jane Lead, and ultimately Valentinian Gnosticism. In the recording, he had briefly mentioned a Neoplatonist named Iamblichus. Most people probably didn't even catch the comment because Steve has so much information. A brief little comment is easy to not notice. But while the recording was off, we had a deeper discussion about Iamblichus. This stirred my curiosity, so I read up on this character. The two works I read were Iamblichus's book, here, On the Mysteries, and Gregory Shaw's book, which was based on his doctoral dissertation, Theurgy and the Soul, the Neoplatonism of Iamblichus. My focus is to discuss some of his teachings that are relevant to their impact on Christianity today. Iamblichus was a leading figure of his day in the most learned circle of the Hellenistic culture. Born around AD 245, he descended from the royal bloodline of priest-kings of Emesa. He died around 325, the year the Nicene Council was held. Not long after Iamblichus's death, the Emperor Julian, also known as Julian the Apostate, attempted to convert the Roman Empire back to paganism after Constantine. Julian was actually Constantine's nephew. Gregory Shaw wrote, quote, "Only one generation after Iamblichus's death, the Emperor Julian employed the Platonic and theurgic doctrines of Iamblichus in an attempt to wrest control of the empire away from the Galileans," referring to the Christians, "and return it to the ancestral practice of Hellenes," referring to Greek paganism. Julian recognized this and intended to repaganize the empire on Iamblichian lines, unquote. This is important to recognize. Julian the Apostate saw in the theurgic doctrine of Iamblichus his main arsenal against Christianity. So when I discuss today that certain sections of Christianity have adopted this philosophy, the two cannot be synthesized together. I should also emphasize for the audience, Gnosticism was primarily a synthesis of Platonism and Christianity. There has been a lot of scholarly publications on this fact, and if you read the Nag Hammadi literature, that is the Gnostic scriptures, which I have a copy of right here, you will find frequently in the introductions to each tractate or in the footnotes drawing connections with Platonism and Gnosticism. Gregory Shaw wrote, quote, "Like Plato, Iamblichus believed his age was threatened by the loss of the gods, and he yearned for the time when gods and men were joined concretely through ritual. With theurgic Platonism, Iamblichus tried to recapture this golden age, and although he succeeded only within Platonic circles, his Syrian school presents probably the best synthesis of philosophy and ritual in the late antique world," unquote. So this simply depicts how influential Iamblichus was in the ancient world, how his philosophy was a threat to Christianity and its relation with Gnosticism. I should note most Gnostic sects differed from Iamblichus in their view that the world, that is, material creation, was inherently evil. However, the Gnostic sect that followed the Hermetic schools would have agreed with Iamblichus that the physical world was good, and physical objects, such as idols, could be used in rituals to worship the gods. By the way, the whole iconoclastic controversy of Christianity, that was the debate about using images and icons in worship, as we find in Catholicism and Eastern Orthodox churches. The whole debate was dependent upon adapting the philosophical arguments of Iamblichus's Theurgy. That is how they justified using images and icons in Christianity. You can now begin to get a gist of how influential his pagan philosophy is in infiltrating Christianity. We often talk about Platonism, that is the philosophy of Plato, but there was at no time a consensus of how to interpret Plato. Plotinus, for example, taught that Plato's philosophy indicated the material world was evil, as did most Gnostic sects in their doctrine of dualism. Iamblichus and some Gnostic sects viewed the demiurge, that is the creator, as a good being, and his creation was good. The dualists' idea of salvation was to escape the physical world, while Iamblichus and some Gnostic sects following the Hermetic school sought to unite the spiritual world with the physical world. This was achieved through a mystical union and divination. So we find two vastly opposite ideas with a bunch of views taking middle grounds between these two extremes, all finding themselves as an interpretation of Plato. This is Platonism, Middle Platonism, Neoplatonism, etc., and the influences on Gnosticism as they attempt to interpret the Bible with Platonism as their presuppositions. Obviously, there was a diversity of views. I use the word theurgy and need to define it since it is a major element of what we are discussing today. Gregory Shaw writes, quote, "The meaning of theurgy in the history of Platonism becomes clear if it is seen as the praxis that allowed souls to move from the experience of embodiment as an isolated prison to the participation in the world soul, where its particularity was reestablished in the unity of the whole," unquote. As Shaw elaborates this definition in the next paragraph, he footnotes a comparison with the method of the practice of yoga. If we think in these terms, yoga seeking union with the gods, though the idea of the gods in Hinduism is monistic and pantheistic, that is, all is one. So the yogi is seeking union with the one, the all. That is similar to how Shaw in this quote uses the term world soul. He writes in the conclusion of this chapter, quote, "In imitation of divine beings, the body of the Theurgus became a vehicle through which the gods appeared to the physical world and through which he received their communion," unquote. So the mystical union is not to be thought of escaping our realm of the physical world to unite with the spiritual realm, but rather the opposite. The Theurgist communes with the spiritual realm to bring the spiritual into the physical vehicle, that is the Theurgist. The word theurgy is derived from the two words theos, God, and ergon, work. It is a divine work. Or, as Shaw expressed, quote, "Iamblichus maintained that since divination came from the gods, it was divine work, hence theurgia," unquote. Iamblichus speaks of divination in these terms, quote, "But if this divine power extends in its predictions to inanimate objects, such as little pebbles, rods, or certain wood, stones, wheat, and barley meal, this is itself the most astonishing prognostication by divine divination, because it gives life to inanimate things." This Greek phrase could be literally translated "gives soul to soulless things," and motion to things motionless, and makes all clear, knowledgeable, and participating in reason, and definable according to the measures of intelligence, and yet having no reason in themselves, unquote. Think of this quote and how it could have been utilized in the iconoclastic controversy or Catholicism's theology of the Eucharist. Iamblichus expresses that theurgy is the work of the gods. They initiate the work, not men manipulating them. Hence, the Catholic or Orthodox Church speaks of their rituals as sacraments, that is, ways to receive grace from God. Iamblichus speaks of wood or stone, wheat or barley. that would connect to statues and images or the Eucharist itself as a wafer one eats. The phrase, "I offer a more literal translation," gives soul to soulless things, is relevant to the view that Christ is called down during the Mass and the wafer, the Mass, becomes Christ. That is Iamblichus's concept of inanimate object, but his emphasis was theurgy of the soul. That is, men becoming divine through the union with the gods, the idea of mystical union I mentioned. In Book 3 of On the Mysteries, Iamblichus has a lot to say about divine inspiration, which he equates with being possessed by the gods. He uses a few important Greek words to understand. One is ekstasin, which we get our word ecstasy in English. Another word is mantikes, which is where we get our English mantic or maniac. These were common Greek terms used to identify their notion of inspiration, which was different from the biblical concept of inspiration. He refers to this experience as divine possession and notes that one can be possessed by good or evil spirits. I want to quote Iamblichus on this topic, and then I will explain how it relates to some of the things Steve Montgomery and I discussed about the NAR. Iamblichus stated, quote, "In this area also I want to make clear the characteristic signs of those who are truly possessed by the gods. For if they have subjected their entire life as a vehicle or instrument to the gods who inspire them, either they exchange their human life for the divine, or they direct their own life toward the god. They neither act according to sensation, nor are they awake in the manner of those who have their senses aroused. Neither do they themselves apprehend the future, nor are they moved like those who act according to purpose. But they are not even conscious of themselves, neither as they were before, nor in any other fashion, nor in general do they turn their personal intelligence upon themselves, nor do they project any personal knowledge." Unquote. This is a good description of how the Greek culture interpreted inspiration. It is what we would call mechanical dictation, though that term is often used inaccurately these days by Christians. Here it depicts a god taking possession of an individual who becomes a machine, a vehicle for the god to drive around. The individual, as a machine, has no thought or consciousness of itself. It is being moved at the whim of whatever is controlling it. The possessed individual, quote, "neither act according to sensation, nor are they awake in the manner of those who have their senses aroused," unquote, which Iamblichus explains later with examples of people being burnt or cut with knives and don't feel it. Think of the event in the Bible when the prophets of Baal are cutting themselves in their opposition to Elijah and Jehovah. Iamblichus describes a possessed individual saying, quote, "they are not even conscious of themselves, neither as they were before, nor in any other fashion, nor in general do they turn their personal intelligence upon themselves, nor do they project any personal knowledge," unquote. The person is not even aware of their self. They are a mere shell being controlled by the spirit inside them. They are unconscious of what they say or speak while they're in this ecstatic state. They are perfectly controlled by the God possessing them. This is what the Bible describes as demonic possession. When God inspired his prophets, they were conscious of what they were speaking in the Lord's name. For example, Jeremiah was being persecuted for prophesying against Jerusalem, so he decided he would stop speaking God's words. In Jeremiah chapter 20, verse 9, it states, quote, "Then I said, I will not make mention of him, nor speak any more in his name. But his word was in mine heart, as a burning fire shut up in my bones, and I was weary with forbearing, and I could not stay." Unquote. The point here is he was consciously in control to stop speaking, though it burned in his heart and he could not remain silent. On another occasion, in Jeremiah 42, verse 7, the Israelites asked Jeremiah to give them the word of God on a specific topic, and it took 10 days for Jeremiah to bring God's word to the people. Jeremiah was not continuously possessed by God's Spirit to respond immediately to the people, nor could he dictate when God would provide the answer for the people. Other examples we find as in Jonah and Habakkuk, who argue with God. They obviously had consciousness to argue with God. So, to reflect on the conversation with Steve Montgomery, some of the prophets in the NAR, the NAR, New Apostolic Reformation, are expressing this idea of angels taking possession of people. In this state, they are wholly given over to the angel's whim. They are expected to perform what Montgomery refers to as a sacred purge, that is, slaughtering people as the NAR deemed to be wicked, because the elite in the NAR, who are possessed by angels, can do so without sin. How is murdering people not sin? Because it is beyond their volition of anger or grudges and purely controlled by these angels who allegedly have only a holy intention, so the murder are not sinful. In Keswick tradition, Robert Purcell Smith, the husband of Hannah Whittle Smith, was exposed and shunned for public preaching because he taught a secret doctrine of erotic spirit baptism. This is commonly assumed to mean erotic in the sense of sexual. It should be understood more so in the sense of Plato's use of eros. Eros, meaning desire, was the innate desire within men that moves them towards the divine. There is a distinction between the vulgar eros, physical attraction or desire, more in the sexual sense, and divine eros, the spiritual ascent towards God. Plato described eros as a daimon, which we say demon, which in Greek thought was not a demon as in the Bible, but rather a spiritual mediator between men and the divine. So eros functioned similarly to the theurgic rituals of Iamblichus to bring an individual to unite with the divine. In the case of the Keswick tradition, the secret doctrine of Robert and Hannah Smith was a mystical ecstatic experience. Gnosticism had its focus on mysticism, and contemporary Christianity is currently seeing an overwhelming explosion of mysticism. My first book, Crept in Unawares Mysticism, was a warning about mysticism infiltrating Christianity. Iamblichus wrote, quote, "Observing this and discovering in general, in accordance with the properties of each of the gods, the receptacles adapted to them, the theurgic art in many cases links together stones, plants, animals, aromatic substances, and other such things that are sacred, perfect, and godlike, and then from all these composes an integrated and pure receptacle," unquote. Dan Kimball essentially argued this in his book, The Emerging Church, this one here. His point in the book was to use various objects, images, candles, and incense to produce the experience of God through sensations. Iamblichus expressed because the gods existed in all of creation, anything of created nature could be used to worship them and affect us to experience the gods. An interesting quote from Gregory Shaw connects this to the homeopathic philosophy that is infiltrating churches today. Shaw writes concerning the use of material objects in theurgic rituals, quote, "As such, they were pure specimens of divine presence in matter, and for souls suffering a specific imbalance within the administration of the divine being, the objects that bore its symbol, synthema, became homeopathic antidotes if handled in a ritually appropriate manner," unquote. This also corresponds with music, Gregorian chanting, and even tongues. Shaw wrote, quote, "Musical theurgy was a form of anamnesis that awakened the soul to its celestial identity with the gods. Musical theurgy came from the gods and gave the soul direct contact with them, unquote. To grasp the significance of how this is infiltrating the church, look at Bethel Redding, or their philosophy of music, which is admittedly influenced by the New Age according to the book The Physics of Heaven. Much of this is through certain tones and sounds, pitches, with repetitive mantra-like lyrics that become meaningless, a method developed from chanting. When music and its lyrics become meaningless, it becomes an object to produce a trance-like ecstatic state of consciousness. Tongues function in the same way. Iamblichus stated, quote, "And the invocations do not arouse inspirations of the intellect or bodily emotions in the one receiving them, for they are wholly unknown and mysterious and are spoken intelligibly only for the gods whom they invoke," unquote. Elsewhere, he argues chanting meaningless names of gods is part of the theurgic rituals that cause one to, quote, "experience union with the gods," unquote. I also found a number of relevant concepts from Iamblichus that correlates with the doctrine of Michael Heiser, but that will have to wait for some future discussion since we are running out of time. In short, I can only express my gratitude to Steve Montgomery for our conversation, both before and while we were recording, for directing me to new and important information that connected a lot of dots for my research. If you haven't seen those interviews, go back and check them out. They're titled From Gnosticism to the NAR, NAR, recorded back in May of this year, 2025. Now, what I was able to share is really only a tip of the iceberg. So if people are interested in more detailed discussions on this topic, let me know in comments below. This is Heath Henning. Thank you for tuning in to Truth Watchers podcast. Remember to hit the subscribe button and share it with a friend. For more fascinating facts, check us out at truthwatchers.com, because sound apologetics and exegesis of scriptures is important for all of God's children, as it is indicated in 3 John verse 4. I have no greater joy than to hear that my children walk in truth.